The effects of World War I are difficult to underestimate. Although the Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars, its conclusion ultimately left a gaping wound in Europe, which would become filled with nationalism, ethnic violence, authoritarianism, and anti-Semitism, ultimately culminating in the destruction of Europe itself through the Second World War. And World War I think, is often a little bit less considered as the turning point of Europe in history, and this is more seen as World War II. But the way that I see it is that World War I was the end of old Europe, and World War II was the destruction of that old Europe. And so today we're going to be checking out World War I by Epic History TV, all the parts. This is a series that goes year by year, so it starts in 1914 and ends in 1918. I'm probably going to make this video 3 parts, but we'll see how far we get. I might pause and talk too much, so we might even just get 1 year in. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, really excited to check this out. This is a fantastic channel. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let's go. Europe goes to war.
1914. The great powers of Europe are divided into 2 rival alliances. The Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia, united by fear and suspicion of Germany, Europe's new strongest power. And the Triple Alliance, Germany, which fears encirclement by its rivals, Austro-Hungary, clinging on to a fragile empire, and Italy, seeking gains at French expense.
Yeah, and so the Triple Alliance is a little bit different than the Triple Entente in a sense. So the Triple Entente is more of an informal alliance. So it's not as in with the Triple Alliance where there is a clear mutual defense pact. So for example, if Italy is attacked by France, therefore Germany and Austria-Hungary would join. Rather, the Triple Entente was a series of alliances. The first one being, I think it was 1894. I might be wrong on the date, but it's in the 1890s, of the Franco-Russian alliance. And this is more of a mutual understanding, their collective fear of Germany. And it's not, although it's not just a trade agreement, this is just a sort of a closer understanding of foreign policy, as well as you have some future agreements between Britain and France, but it is no way a defense pact. So eventually, when France goes to war against Germany, it takes a few days until Britain also declares on Germany as well.
The spark comes on the 28th of June in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated by a 19-year-old Slav nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Austro-Hungary accuses its Balkan rival Serbia of having aided the assassin and sends an ultimatum demanding humiliating concessions.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that I think this is 10 points, or maybe it's 12 points that the Austrians send to the Serbians, and the Serbians agree to all of them except for one. But Franz Josef, absolutely furious over the assassination of his heir, still goes to war with Serbia. And with World War II, it's a little bit different in the sense that there was a clear plan from the beginning, and although appeasement did fail, it was very obvious that there was going to be conflict for the Second World War, and it could not be stopped, as much as the Allied powers tried. In World War I, it was a snowballing effect. Tensions were already high at this point between the major European powers. There was the incident in Morocco in 1910, which also already almost led to World War I, as well as the German Anglo naval arms race. And so tensions are really, really high, sort of post 1867 here. And Austria-Hungary, as a sort of not quite the sick man of Europe in the same way that the Ottomans were, but an empire that at this point is a dual monarchy, and ethnic and national tensions, which were very, very prevalent throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, are spiraling into what would eventually become the death of the empire.
Serbia rejects the ultimatum, and Austro-Hungary declares war.
Yeah, and even before Austro-Hungary declares war, Kaiser Wilhelm is desperately trying to avoid this in any way that he possibly can. But he's even sending letters back and forth between Tsar Nicholas II, who they were cousins, by the way, and it's just a slow sort of sleepwalk, as it's sort of referred to, or how I've read it as referred to, into this Great World War.
Within hours, Austrian forces are shelling Belgrade. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, feels honor-bound to defend Serbia, a fellow Slav nation, and orders the Russian army to mobilize. German Emperor Wilhelm II has promised his support to Austro-Hungary. He and his generals see conflict with Russia as inevitable, and the sooner the better, as Russian strength grows year on year.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Kaiser Wilhelm II. There's this weird Kaiserboo phase that's like, it's kind of popular on the internet. But anyways, yeah, so Germany issues what's known as the blank check to Austria. This was not literally a check that was issued. Which is basically that we'll support you in anything as well as going to war. And this was probably the first catastrophe in terms of policy of the First World War. And you have to wonder, what if Germany had been a little bit more cautious? What if they hadn't have just jumped right into it with Austro-Hungary? Although, again, not every single player in the German government is ecstatic for war. Some of them are very cautious about it. But, well, I'll talk about how the public reacted in a little bit. But you gotta wonder, if they hadn't issued that blank check, what might have happened?
Russian mobilization is used to justify German mobilization, followed by a declaration of war on Russia.
Russia mobilized very fast.
Germany knows war with Russia means war with Russia's ally, France. It has developed the Schlieffen Plan to meet this threat of a war on two fronts.
Yeah, this is going to be a long video. Okay, they're going to explain. I was going to explain the Schlieffen Plan, but it's important to note here, by the way, that it's actually named after someone, General Schlieffen. It wasn't just like a code name. And at this point, I think he's been dead for 20 years before the Schlieffen Plan itself is actually executed.
First, its armies
This is going to be a really long video.
will advance rapidly through neutral Belgium to encircle and destroy French armies near Paris and win a quick victory. Then its forces can move east to...
Yes, and so even then, so the Kaiser, well, not the Kaiser himself, but the German government really asks Belgium to move troops through their land. They say, we don't want to harm your citizens, we don't want to fight you, we just want to move through your lands into French territory. And the Belgians refuse. And that is really the kickoff here of how what eventually brings Britain into the war as well.
Deal with Russia, whose huge army will take much longer to mobilize. And so Germany declares war on France.
Yes.
6 million men are now marching to war across Europe.
And so what's important to note too is that unlike in the Second World War, during the First World War, when war was declared in both France and Germany and Austria-Hungary, it was hysteria in a positive sense. It was war hysteria. There were crowds cheering in the streets. It was seen as an overwhelmingly positive thing that was going to happen. This was for honor. This was for might, for country to finally show that X country is the dominant one on the European continent. And people were ecstatic, right? There was, I don't remember the writer off the top of my head, but a pacifist writer that was pretty much quickly silenced by the jubilance that he saw in Paris, and not him specifically, but there were also present in Berlin. And I think that's something that's important to recognize, is that during this point, because they haven't had the experience of the brutalness and bloodiness that is the First World War, this is still sort of the old, I would argue, European mentality of war that's a lot different than the modern killing machines that these men will soon experience.
Italy, however, remains neutral. The terms of the Triple Alliance don't bind it to join an offensive war.
Yep.
The United States also declares its neutrality. President Wilson and the American public have no desire to get entangled in Europe's war.
Yep.
Britain is France's ally, but at first it's not clear if it will join the war against Germany. But when German troops invade Belgium, whose neutrality Britain has guaranteed, an ultimatum is sent from London to Berlin, demanding they withdraw. It's ignored, and Britain declares war.
Which also shocked the Germans. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected that the pact between Belgium and Britain, which I think at this point, I'm not exactly sure on the year, but it's a couple decades old. This is not something that was signed 2 years ago. And Britain really joining the war is, yeah, this is one of the first downfalls of Germany. And so you not only have Britain joining the war, you have all her colonies as well, right? So India, Australia, at this point, South Africa, Canada, importantly. And so I could do a whole video on Canada in World War I because it's such an important event for our history. So yeah, you pretty much within a few days, you have the majority of the world, or the majority of the territory in the world, if you will, fighting against now Germany and Austria-Hungary.
A British expeditionary force lands in France, while the German invasion is held up for crucial days by Belgian resistance at the fortress city of Liège.
Yep.
German troops commit several massacres against Belgian civilians. The atrocities are inflated by Allied propaganda and help turn public opinion in neutral countries against Germany. France.
One question I do have is that I know why the Netherlands didn't join the war. It's because they were a very capable fighting force at this point. In Germany, I mean, the war would have ended much sooner if they had invaded the Netherlands. But I'm curious, what was the public opinion on the Belgian massacres in the Netherlands? Because there's a lot of shared history there. So I'm kind of curious about that, actually. If you are Dutch yourself or you happen to know the answer, put it in the comments below.
Unaware of Germany's great encircling attack, launches Plan 17, an offensive into German territory.
Yep. And funny, so this is Alsace-Lorraine, a piece of territory that has been, well, that had been, what would you say, contested for quite a long time between Germany and France. And Germany had just won this territory in the Franco-Prussian War, which then led to the declaration of Germany itself, the reunification of Germany, the unification of Germany, not reunification of Germany. That would happen in 1991. Anyways, I already did a video on that one. Go check it out if you haven't seen it. I'll leave the time card thing in the top right here.
But in the Battle of the Frontiers, they're driven back with enormous losses on both sides.
Yeah. So you can see this, right? So already in merely weeks, there has been nearly 1 million men lost in weeks. Right? When you look at these casualties, and again, a casualty does not mean that they're dead. It does mean wounded as well. But still, right? Already, the numbers of this are unbelievable.
The British Expeditionary Force clashes with the German army at Mons. But the British are heavily outnumbered and soon join the French in retreat. The Allies make their stand at the River Marne, 40 miles outside Paris. Their desperate counterattack saves the city and drives the Germans back.
And so there's some reminders here of the Franco-Prussian War, of how the Germans very quickly did take, well, not very quickly, within a few months, did take Paris. And it's close. It's only 40 kilometers out, which really, for a marching army, is not that far. So you'd have to think they were really on their back legs at this point, and morale was certainly sinking in France at this point as well.
Both sides suffer 250,000 casualties.
So we're up to...
The race to the sea begins, as both sides try to outflank each other to the north. A series of clashes leads to the First Battle of Ypres, where the Allies desperately cling on and prevent a German breakthrough.
And Ypres would also later be the first place where chemical weapons were used in warfare.
There are more heavy losses on both sides. The two armies then dig in along the entire 350-mile front, seeking shelter from deadly machine gun fire and artillery shells.
It looks like a Scottish unit.
Trench warfare has begun.
Right, and so the idea of this quick offensive now, the Schlieffen Plan to really just puncture through Belgium, quickly capture Paris. The French then would sue for peace. They would probably get some sort of territorial concessions and war reparations and something along these lines, and then the Germans can then push into Russia. That was the idea. But now that they've dug in on a 350-mile front, which is... Oh God, my metric system here is going to fail me. I usually use kilometers. Anyways, this is really what World War I is famous for here. Is not these fast-moving fronts that would later become in the Second World War, but rather the stale, the stale trench warfare where hundreds of meters would be gained for hundreds of thousands of lives.
British warships win the first naval battle of the war at Heligoland Bight, sinking 3 German cruisers. Britain has the most powerful navy in the world, 29 modern battleships to Germany's 19. They now impose a naval blockade on Germany, preventing contraband goods, including food, from reaching it by sea. The aim is to bring Germany's economy to its knees and force it to surrender.
And this blockade is incredibly successful. And so I'm skipping ahead a bit in time here, but by 1917, the Turn-Up Winter, as it's referred to, the naval blockade is extremely successful at basically just starving the Germans out. And what this is also one of the key reasons why Germany could not have really won the First World War had they have not, if they had have captured Paris, sure, perhaps. But this naval blockade is just devastating for the country and its resources.
But a week later, the British cruiser HMS Pathfinder becomes the first victim in history of a lethal new weapon. The submarine-launched torpedo.
Yep.
German submarines, or U-boats, have a surface range of 9,000 miles and can attack undetected from beneath the waves.
All right, so look at that. So you're living in, you're living in New York, or you're living in Newfoundland, and you can, a German U-boat could travel from Kiel or something all the way over to there. Just think about that.
They herald a deadly new challenge to Britain's command of the seas. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies invade East Prussia, but they blunder into disaster at the Battle of Tannenberg, where General von Hindenburg and his Chief of Staff, Erich Ludendorff, mastermind a brilliant German victory, taking 90,000 prisoners and destroying an entire Russian army.
And this would go to make Hindenburg and Ludendorff incredibly famous at home and would gradually increase their position in the government itself. So not that they were promoted or anything, but their influence, their power, right, would really push eventually the Kaiser out of the decision-making process. And by 1917, 1918, it's really the military and with Hindenburg and Ludendorff at the helm of it, really running the government. They'll slowly take over civil matters and have more influence there as well.
The Russians contribute to their own defeat by transmitting uncoded wireless messages. A second massive German victory at Masurian Lakes forces the Russians into retreat. In just 6 weeks, the Russian army suffers nearly 1/3 casualties. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungary's invasion of Serbia suffers a humiliating reverse at the Battle of Tser.
It's also important to note here that this is not the first war in the Balkans recently. I believe it was in 1912, I want to say, but there's the Balkan Wars between the Ottoman empires and the Balkan countries, so Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and that ultimately leads to their victory and the Ottoman Empire further receding back into modern Turkey and the Middle East, and their European influence slowly waning.
Austro-Hungary's offensive against Russia also ends in disaster and retreat, with the loss of more than 300,000 men.
And at this point, the Austro-Hungarian, this is going to be the longest video ever, the Austro-Hungarian Empire has outdated equipment. They also have issues within their officer ranks, right? They have multiple languages that are being spoken. They have Hungarian, Czech, even Ukrainian, some Polish, German, obviously, Slovakian, etc., all being spoken within this army, and there's an issue with command and control. And it's not to say that this was the first time they ever noticed that everyone speaks a different language, but when you have an army that is operating under multiple different languages, you have an officer corps that is all required to speak German. Obviously, the command and control could be made more difficult.
The fortress town of Przemysl is cut off and besieged by the Russians. The Germans are forced to come to the rescue, launching a diversionary attack towards Warsaw. It leads to weeks of brutal winter fighting around the Polish city of Łódź, but there is no clear winner. Meanwhile, the Turkish Ottoman Empire has joined the Central Powers, declaring war on its old enemy, Russia.
Which at this point they'd been fighting for a few hundred years. Not consistently, but yeah, to call them their old adversary is almost an understatement. It's almost their ancient adversary for the Ottomans and the Russians to go to war.
Turkish warships bombard the Russian ports of Odessa and Sevastopol, while in the
Wouldn't that be Ottoman?
Caucasus, Russian troops cross the Turkish frontier. Beyond Europe, the war rages on the world's oceans and in far-flung European colonies. German troops cross into British East Africa, modern Kenya, and occupy Taveta, while Allied forces seize the German colony of Togoland, modern Togo. But British forces invading German Cameroon are defeated at Garoua and Nsangakong, while a 3,000-strong force attacking German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, is captured at Saint-Fontaine. A month later, British landings at Tanga end in chaos and defeat at the hands of a much smaller German force led by Colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck. Cut off from Germany, Lettow-Vorbeck goes on to wage a highly successful guerrilla war against the Allies, tying down huge numbers of troops.
Fascinating. I didn't know that.
In Asia, Japan honors its treaty with Britain and declares war on Germany. Japanese forces go on to seize the German naval base at Tsingtao. The German colonies of Samoa and New Guinea surrender to troops from New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah, because at this point, Germany just doesn't have the resources to be able to defend her entire empire, and so. Yeah, the Far East really, that would come to be a more important theater in the Second World War as opposed to the First World War.
But in the Pacific, off the coast of Chile, German Admiral von Spee's powerful East Asia squadron sinks 2 British cruisers at the Battle of Coronel. Both ships are lost with all hands. 5 weeks later, he runs into a British naval task force at the Falkland Islands. 4 of the 5 German cruisers are sunk. Von Spee goes down with his flagship.
Interesting.
Meanwhile, in the Middle East, British troops seize control of the Ottoman port of Basra, securing access to the vital Persian oil that fuels the British fleet.
Very, very important. And at this point too, there's the British and the Russians are vying for influence in the Middle East itself. So in modern Afghanistan, Iraq at this point known as Persia. So Iran, known as Persia, right? Modern Iraq, and so they're also conflict within that region as well, which dates back before the First World War.
That winter, Austrian troops finally capture Belgrade. But the Serbs then counterattack and drive them back once more. The fighting in Serbia has already cost around 200,000 casualties on each side. In the North Sea, German warships mount a hit-and-run raid against English coastal towns, shelling Hartlepool, Whitby and Scarborough, and killing more than 100 civilians. On the Western Front, the French launched their first major offensive against the German lines. But the First Battle of Champagne leads to small gains at a cost of 90,000 casualties.
And this would be the running theme throughout the Western Front, right? I mean, All Quiet on the Western Front really isn't... It's a good title, right? Investen nicht Neues, right? In the West, nothing new. In the fact that, as I said before, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives would be lost for mere... maybe a few kilometers if it was an incredibly successful offensive, and then they would be pushed right back, right? It was this constant just back and forth, and the amount of lives lost for inches of territory. I mean, if you could, it's kind of a morbid way of looking at it, but if you could measure it in blood, it'd be a haunting visual, to say the least.
While in the Caucasus, an Ottoman offensive through the mountains in midwinter ends in disaster at Sarikamish. Turkish casualties total 60,000, many frozen to death. On the Western Front, that first Christmas is marked in some sectors by a short truce and games of football in no man's land.
Yeah, famous
the
event.
Killing zone between the trenches.
And what's made worse, too, is that the next day, the day after Christmas, so Boxing Day, if you will, the officers then force the men to go over the top, which going over the top refers to when you're sitting in the trenches and you have trench warfare. Artillery would first be shelled on the enemy position, and then the infanteers would then go over the top, right? So hop over the trenches, run through no man's land. You can imagine how terrifying this is, right? Run through no man's land, which is the area between the attacking and defending armies for the trenches, and then would have to run into the trenches and then engage the soldiers in close quarters combat, hoping for them then to push back, and then they would gain that area of trenches. You can only imagine how terrifying this would be when you have modern weapons as well, such as machine guns that are able to fire hundreds of rounds a minute, which was a relatively modern innovation. So there's a great new there's a new remake of All Quiet on the Western Front. It's out on Netflix. It's in German. You can watch it with English subtitles, and I'd highly recommend that for some of the battle scenes, because it really does depict the absolute brutality that this war had. Okay, so we're 20 what can I do? I can't talk today. We're 28 minutes in, and I just got through 1914. So I think I'm going to end it here, and then I'll leave it up to you guys. For the next video, if I happen to talk as long, should I just make it an hour-long video on 1915, 1916, or should I do it year by year? And so then this would be a 5-part series, if you will. I'll do them back to back, so I'll do one per day. If I make this a 5-part series, I won't stretch it out over a week or something. But I want to know what you think. I'm going to put a pinned comment down below, so please answer me there. If you want this to be 1 year per video, or you want me to make them longer videos and maybe do 2 years each. Let me know what you think. But again, another great video here from Epic History TV. Love this channel. Their Great Northern War series was fantastic. Their Napoleon one as well. So yeah, thank you very much for joining me. Very much appreciate it. World War I here. Fascinating point in history, and I hope you're enjoying it. Thank you all very much. Take care, and I'll see you guys next